From garbage to stuff, how we recycle plastics. We're going to talk a little bit about where plastics come from, a little about how some common plastic articles are made, a fair amount about how the recycling process works, and then some about the economics and some things maybe that you can do about the process as well. Plastics are polymers, and the word polymer is derived from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and the Greek root mer, which we think means units. So what we're talking about for plastics as polymers are things that are comprised of many units. Well, if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself, how big does a many-united molecule have to be? And the answer is big enough to get polymeric properties. Now, usually at this point in the presentation, someone in the back of the room raises his hand and says, "But Bill, that's an awfully circular definition, isn't it?" And the answer is yes, but I stole it out of a textbook, so it must be correct. But it really does have some correctness to it, because polymers act differently than small molecules do, and let me show you what I mean. The polymeric properties that we're talking about are mainly derived from entanglement of molecules. Now, so take a look at what I'm doing here. I have some small pieces of yarn that I'm pulling apart kind of like this, and you can see they come apart fairly easily, and they fall apart without too much trouble. That's because they're not very entangled, and in fact, they're kind of like small molecules. They sort of roll over one another fairly easily, they flow fairly easily. But now take a look at these. These are longer strings. This wad of string, I can't pull those strings apart, and the reason is because they're entangled. And in fact, polymer molecules are the same way. They get their strength also from being entangled with one another. Now here's a very simple example. If you've ever used PVC pipe, you know that the way that you join it is to take the pipe and a fitting, and you put a little glue on the pipe and glue on the fitting, and you put them together. The reason you have a strong joint is because you have loosened the ends of the molecules on the pipe and also on the fitting. And then when you put them together, you give them an opportunity to relax back together and entangle. There are two kinds of polymers based on the way they process. First are thermoplastics. Thermoplastics are materials that you form by heating. When you heat them up, they soften, and you can change them from one shape into another shape. This is important to us for the recycling process because it means that I can have one article that I return to commerce as another article because I've been able to melt it and shape it into a different shape. Now, the other type of plastic is called a thermoset. Thermosets are materials that react differently to heat. In fact, what happens is they get tougher and tougher and harder as you heat them. And the reason is because you're growing new bonds in this material. You're not melting it. In fact, a thermoset will char before it will melt because it's creating new bonds inside the plastic. Think of it this way. Instead of those long strings that we had before, imagine starting as strings that then grow struts in between them, so now you have a net. And then imagine if you didn't have just one net, but a number of them all strung together, so that in 3 dimensions you have all these molecules knitted up. Well, that's what a thermoset is like. And in fact, if you have an article that's made from a thermoset, you may have an article that's the size of your fist that consists of only one molecule because of all of the cross-links that have grown among the individual molecules that we started out with. Now, here's a way of keeping these things separate. Thermoplastics are like butter. So you've all been to nice restaurants where they have these little buttery things that they've molded. Well, the way they made those was to soften the butter, pour it in the mold, chill it, and then set them out for the evening. Now, in fact, you could go out at the end of the evening and pick up the little leftover buttery things and take them back to the kitchen, melt them down, pour them in the mold, chill them, and set them out tomorrow night. Now, of course, that would be disgusting, but you could do that because butter is a thermoplastic. Now, consider thermosets. Thermosets are like bread. Have you ever considered doing the melt the piece of bread experiment? And how did that turn out? Well, it turned out as burnt toast, and the reason is because bread is a thermoset, and in fact, it will char before it will melt. So when someone wakes you up at 3 in the morning and asks you what the difference is between thermoplastics and thermosets, you can tell them it's the difference between butter and bread. So here's an industrial example of recycling a thermoplastic. The process that we're looking at this slide is a process to make cups. They could be drink cups, they could be cottage cheese containers. All of them are made by a process called vacuum forming. In vacuum forming, a sheet of plastic is heated under a quartz heater, goes over a bank of molds, and a vacuum is drawn, pulling the warm, soft plastic down into the mold. Then the top is cut to release the cup from the sheet, and the sheet moves on.
Now look again at what's left of that sheet.
This looks a lot like maybe we were making cookies, where we just sort of cut the cookies out of this sheet. And in fact, it's very similar to that. But if you were making cookies, would you throw that leftover dough away? Of course not. What you would do is roll it up, make more sheet, and cut more cookies. And in fact, you can do exactly the same thing as that in this industrial process. This is called post-industrial recycling. And literally billions and billions of pounds are recycled in this way every year, but you never hear about it. The guy who is making the cups sells his leftover sheet back to the guy who makes the sheet because he can get paid for it instead of having to pay to send it to a landfill. The guy who makes the sheet buys the recycle because it costs him less then to make new sheet, and he can keep his costs down in selling it to the guy who makes the cups. And the process goes around and around and around.